4, 3, 2, and 1. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Art of Move podcast. I am Anthony Manuel. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. William Raybar, and we're going to be talking about all different kinds of topics today. It's going to be more of a free flow episode. Both Will and I have been pretty busy with our own personal stuff and haven't had as much time to plan out topics. There's a few things that came in via social media. So you can follow me on Twitter at Anthony R. Manuel, Manuele, or on Instagram at The Body Moves. And then Will is at The Art of Move on Instagram. If you ever have topic requests or different ideas that you want to share with us, we have a few different nuanced points that we want to kind of cover today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some stuff that I've been experimenting with in my personal movement practice that I found has really changed my lived experience of movement. And we're gonna dive in. We're gonna see what we can cover today and where we go. And one of the first things that we wanted to talk about was one of the low-hanging fruits that we talk about for posture and for movement and for movement quality is one of the GOTA's universal principles of being back chain dominant, having your hips behind your rib cage so that the musculature and the fascia and the connective tissue of your posterior chain is predominantly the driving force and the most active part of your body. When you shift your hips forward, which we tend to do from sitting in our chairs, outsourcing our structural stability to the backs of chairs, and like leaning into counters with our hips, and basically just having our hips shift forward. Deadlifts, having this hip forward movement, squats where your hips move from back to front and you're locking your hips out in front of your rib cage all the time. This tends to neurologically pattern in and even structurally pattern in what's called front chain dominance. And it's not as structurally secure. It's not as structurally decompressed for our joints. It's not as beneficial. But we did want to talk a little bit about when it's appropriate to be in your front chain and when you can add front chain training into your regimen. I think it's one topic that I kind of wanted to explore. But when you were thinking about this topic that you wanted to kind of dive into, what angle were you thinking of going at it?
Well, a couple things. One, the simplest way I can put it is that if your hips are in front of your ribs, in general, you'll be tensioning the front of your body. Imagine you have elastics, like a giant elastic in the front of your body and the giant elastic on the back of your body going from your feet to your head. If you're leaning backwards, and that's when your hips are in front of your ribs, that front elastic is going to be tensioned. And that's what you're doing. That's the hip flexors, the quads, the rectus abdominis, everything's pulled together in that front chain. And that's not where you want to be doing your work from. That's not what you want to be getting used to. A lot of people have tight hip flexors, tight quads. It's like that. You'll never get rid of that unless you start going back chain, right? So it is a behavior change right off the get-go. And I wanted to get into the difference of being back chain, like the state of being back chain, and being front chain dominant. Okay. So for me, I had my hips in front of my ribs for so long, especially when I'm sitting, resting. I never rested on the ground. Basically, I had a really, really front chain dominant pattern, and it still shines through now. Even though my hips go behind my ribs and I'm really adamant about it, the front of my body was locked for so long that, let's say my abs get pulled in towards my hips in the front. So my hips will be behind me, but I'm still in that closed position. Like that elastic is pulling tighter in the front because I'm so neurologically used to it. I'm so mechanically used to it, even though it's way, way better than before. So I'm back chain dominant in my position, but front chain dominant in my behavior. Do you get what I'm saying? Everything's pulling forward, even though my hips are behind me. I want my hips to be behind me, and I want to decompress the front of my body and get it nice and long. So you'll see that nice long spine on a lot of back chain dominant athletes. I don't have that quite as much. It seems more compressed, but it's getting better slowly. Okay, so that's really the nuanced difference there.
So I just want to make a clarifying point. When you say that you've spent a lot of time in that front chain dominant position, I have too. Obviously, like I've reclined into chairs and like deadlifted for 90% of my lifts. I was almost a deadlift specialist, basically pushing my hips forward past and when I watch videos of my old deadlifting, I would lock my hips past my rib cage. I really neurologically ingrained that pattern. And same thing, I got this standing desk that I do the podcast in, and I stay back to I'm actively thinking about staying back chain dominant. But all the front chain compression stuff between deadlifting and then doing all the compressive work for my rectus abdominis and serratus and all this like gymnastics work where I'm pulling that whole front chain in, like it's taking a long time to basically reverse that compression, both structurally and neurologically. But now that you're living more back chain dominant, are you saying that there are still structural obstructions to, moving in a back chain dominant position? Or is it that your neurology is so used to moving and, to accommodate this front chain dominant position that you haven't neurologically rewired your patterns yet?
It's both. However, you can rewire, like I can get going on rewiring my patterns right away. That is the butt behind rib cage behavior. Because the more I do it, the more my brain's going to accept it. My spinal cord's going to accept it. It's going to be a more relaxed position. I'm going to find the nuances to the feeling. However, I did spend years in that front chain dominant position. The tissues are just getting crushed in that front chain, right? So it takes a while, even when you get the behavior down, to really unload that front chain, unload the tissues, and get everything nice and elongated. We could talk about how to do that. However, that is where I'm at right now. I'm trying to become more back chain in not only butt behind rib cage, but getting everything elongated as I move. Okay, so I was looking at a boxing video I posted the other day, and I'm back chain dominant. My hips are behind my ribs the whole time. However, you can see my spine compressed a little bit. Now, in boxing, that's kind of a thing to do. You are supposed to kind of shell up. However, I'm not trying to be a boxer. I'm trying to live. So my boxing won't exactly, when I'm just out there practicing and having fun, I don't want to look like a boxer. I want to practice the behavior that's going to last longer, that's going to bring me to an old age. And that will be to be back chain dominant. Okay. So there's a little bit of a nuance there.
Yeah. And so, that's the morphology of back chain dominant positions. We're talking about natural human states, the most optimal way for the human body to move and behave in space. That butt behind ribcage position is great. It's really beneficial for forward locomotion. It promotes better control at the hip, ankle, and knee for being able to change direction. It gives you more options and more access into that hip socket to rotate in different directions. But it's not going to be universally relevant to different sports. For example, like if you're hunched in, you're crunched in for boxing, like you might not end up being back chain. You might be going back quite a bit and leaning your chest back to develop a rhythm so that you can be more evasive in a martial arts setting, right? Like you see that quite a bit in different really, really well. I mean, when we did our Conor McGregor breakdown, he was front chain dominant even when he was in his sort of peak, when he was like that, when his movement was still really, really good. He was still pretty front chain dominant with his hips cocked forward a little bit so that he could almost like spring a kick or have that distance between him and his opponent. So it's going to be relevant. Back chain dominance is mostly relevant for living optimally as a human being. Like you said, I'm not trying to be a boxer. I'm trying to live. You like boxing and you practice rhythm and it's part of your movement practice, but you're not trying to optimize your morphology to be a boxer.
Yeah, exactly. And there is different styles of martial arts where you can have your spine more upright. Even some boxers, Floyd Mayweather comes to mind. He's not really hunched over. Conor McGregor is a little bit, although I question how much he this might be a little bit of a, just a observation at my, but I think he's a little bit ego driven in that he stands up nice and tall and tries to bring the chest forward. That like classic, this is how you get the best posture, right? Like where your chest is nice and high and you're kind of like leaning in that WODA front chain dominant, hips way in front of the chest position. As long as you're upright and tall, I think that's what he's got going on. And then he mixes that with a little bit of swagger, right? So
yeah,
he does display a lot of back chain dominance in his fighting, but in his life, I noticed a lot of front chain dominant behavior. That's just an aside, right? Yeah. Sorry, I missed the original question there.
Yeah, it was less. It was more just of an observation, right? Like when we talk about back chain dominant behavior, We're talking about what is going to optimize your spine to be long and decompressed naturally, what is going to promote the best range of motion through your hips so that your weight distribution is adequate. And like that back chain dominant behavior is not going to be universally applicable to every sport all the time, right? So maybe when you're talking about getting into your front chain and developing front chain dominance, like all like the hips behind rib cage or in front of the rib cage thing, that's something that you can test. You can stand up and feel that directly right now. Like if you push your hips forward and you start leaning, you can feel your quads start firing to keep you from falling, your abs start fall, like everything in the front side of your body starts firing to keep you from falling backwards. Right. And there are situations in gymnastics or in different sports where keeping your balance and getting into your front chain is very, very, beneficial. In terms of direct front chain training, do you think there's a place for, in a movement practice to really emphasize the, getting into your front chain?
Um, I don't personally think there is. And this is the million
Mm,
dollar question, right? Because a lot of training, a lot of traditional training that most people are used to at this point is front chain. Hip thrusts come to mind, deadlifts, squats, traditionally done, even kettlebell swings where your pelvis is accelerating forward, your spine is accelerating backwards, which is exactly what you're trying to avoid when you're in locomotion. I don't know if this can be really denied. If you look at the slow motion, it's really when you're running, your hips don't accelerate forward so much as you're staying behind, like back chain dominant hips behind ribs the whole time, and you're moving from there. And the movement is really more rotary and side to side. So for me, I have very little place for it, maybe 5% when I'm stretching or just trying to access a position to feel something out. But I'd never really train in front chain position ever, really.
hmm. Very, very interesting. So, like, the thing that comes to mind in terms of relevance for me is like, well, what about sit ups or like training your rectus abdominis? What about any, pushing movement that engages your front chain? I think of push ups as a front chain dominant behavior in a lot of ways, not necessarily because it's pushing your hips forward, but because the sort of resistance to gravity or that downward pulling force towards the ground, your people are like, well, a push-up is basically a plank, right? So it's like planks and these things that are drawing that midsection in and activating and creating rigidity through the core. We've done enough work and we've done enough episodes on why we don't believe in too much direct core training creating rigidity through your spine. We're big spinal engine advocates, and the ability to maintain spinal mobility is really, really important for not just locomotion but also feeling good in general. But do you think, like, is there such a thing as core stability? Should we be thinking about what function in this locomotive picture do abdominal muscles have?
A lot of what you said there is really interesting, right? Like, let me go back and answer a few things there. So I do train front chain dominant musculature and fascial lines. I just make sure my butt's behind my rib cage and my spine is elongated as I do it. Butt behind rib cage, spine elongated. So when I look at those pictures of the J-shaped spine where indigenous show more of like just a small lumbar curve and a more straight upper back,
Mm,
where Westerners will show a big S curve where, the lumbar spine has a really big bend and the thoracic spine has a really big bend. And there's the
mhm,
corresponding thoracic bend. Um, I move more towards the J shaped spine and have all I'm thinking now as a low hanging cue is butt behind my rib cage and keep my spine long at the same time. And I only have to have my rib cage a little bit in front of my my hips a little bit behind my rib cage. It doesn't have to
mhm,
be a major effort. However, if I'm going to run full speed, my hips better be behind my rib cage big time. The faster I
mm,
go, the more it requires that back chain dominance to be safe. Okay? So when I'm walking around, yeah, I'm at a low level, I'll probably only be an inch behind, ideally, an inch behind my ribs, right? But when I'm cutting, my hips better be way behind my ribs in order to stay, you know, a lot safer.
mhm.
Um, yeah. So the last question you had, what was it again?
It was what instance would you be training the front chain musculature? right? I think
Uh,
that was the question, because I
yeah,
went all over the place, but it's like, you know, if we're if our movement practice is centered around optimizing locomotion,
yeah.
what role does training front chain musculature have in that locomotive picture in your mind?
I got you. Okay. So, uh, stability, I only really want enough stability so I can go head over foot, so I can be in my columns as I land. If I'm controlling that at a sprint pace, that's very, very optimal. Okay.
Mm,
If I can control it, like in boxing, if I'm moving around and I can control, uh, a pivot at a fast speed because my head's over my foot, in my mind, I've displayed a lot of core control, a lot of core quote unquote stability, but really my spine was moving along with the movement. Okay. So there was never really a time where it was stable when you define it as not non moving.
mm,
Okay. And I'm not moving it in a rectus abdominis way where I'm doing a sit up. That's not really
mm,
happening. I want to do the reverse of a sit up as I'm moving, right? So basically, I want my spine long. I want my sternum away from my pubis. Okay, so I want my basically my belly button to be away from away from the pubis, right? So ribs and pelvis are separating in the front, getting as long as they can in the front without having that stripper butt, right? You want to keep nice and long and have that J shape lumbar curve.
yeah, it's a
So
J, not a Donald Duck butt, right?
exactly, right? So I have very little training in the front chain dominant, sit ups or anything like that. I just don't think it's relevant to locomotion. Um, However, is it relevant to getting your muscles bigger in the front? If you like abs, you'll probably have to do a little bit of that, right? Like to get the bigger abdominal look. However, what you want to do is make sure that those are long and not pulling you too far on the front chain because you've just worked them neurologically, made them tense, that it's just pulling you in the front chain all day. And that's not that hard to do. Okay.
No, it's not.
Most of what we're doing in daily life is front chain dominant behaviors. So why not promote back chain dominant behaviors in your training in order to counteract what 99% of us are doing all day? It makes more sense to me that way.
Like, would you say, like, if you're doing direct rectus abdominis work, that six pack muscle that forces your spine to close in on itself like that in the front chain, would you do an equal amount of back extension work? Like, I know it's pure vanity, right? But would you want to have that same amount of flexion and extension so that you're able to, because I know for me, like, when I was into CrossFit, I did like 4 gazillion toes to bar and GHD sit-ups and everything that was like contracting. But like, ask me how many Superman holds I did, or ask me how much I actually stretched my rectus abdominis and allowed that fascial line to, extend. Like, I was chronically pushed in, and I can still, when I'm not paying attention, or I have a couple of days where my movement practice is a little off, I revert back to those old neurological patterns. I see myself collapsed in on myself, and it's not because I don't have a strong back. I have a really strong back, but I did close in my whole front chain quite a bit, and I'm working on creating the position where I can open it up a little bit. Would you add an equal amount of like back extension work if you're training your core directly?
I mean, you could do it that way. However, I don't personally parse the body out like that anyway. I don't
Yeah.
do the equal amount front and back. That's not how I look at the body, and that's not how I see the fascial chains. Um, so to answer that question, instead of that, let's say I was a bodybuilder, right? Or I'm doing exercises for my abs and I'm really pumping them up. I want to get those big rectus abdominis so I have the six pack for the summer, right?
Mm,
I would want to get my ribs as far forward from my hips as possible and do some breathing in that area, right? So I'm
mm,
I'm elongating it. I'm not quite like just doing Supermans just for the sake of, oh, okay, my back musculature that's super tense is going to pull my super tense front musculature into a better position. I don't want that. I want my front musculature to relax so that I can do other activities and not have like a balance of super tense muscles on either side pulling. Do you get
right.
what I'm saying? I don't want to
Yeah, I
battle
do.
tension with tension. It's like,
Well, I mean, like,
I don't have to.
I I showed you that thing where, I created so much fascial and muscular tension in through my my lats especially, and my whole front chain, that when I side bend, I literally have pressure pushing air in and out of my lungs like a pump. Like, it's not me breathing. I'll just bend from side to side and it literally pumps air in and out because of how tense and how tight that's become. I'm trying to reverse that right now, but it's painful. It's painstaking. I'm like trying to undo these fascial adhesions all through my rib cage and all through my lats and all that stuff, specifically from creating that. And when I run, I always have a little bit of a pump out. So it's, it affects my breathing. So being able to be in that back chain and breathe really, really deep, I literally feel that constriction starting from the center of my ribs, going all the way into my lats, holding me back quite a bit. Like, that's the ability to relax the front of your body. We have a culture that's like abs, right? And you see the mirror selfies, it's always front chain dominant so that the abs will be flexed a little bit more. That's what the cultural paradigm is. And it kind of screws us up, right?
How long, like, I'm going to be honest with you. I probably lived 10 to 15 years of my life semi contracting that area, you
Mm,
know, especially in the summer. You're walking around, why not get a little bit of a pump there and walk around with your abs a little bit more contracted? However, that equals front chain, right? So
mm,
the actual, like, the dirty secret here is that when you're elongated in the front, you don't really have that crushed out six pack that everyone loves, right?
yeah.
Like your front looks a little bit more elongated, where maybe you don't have that look that is standard in Western culture, right? The front of my body doesn't exactly look like there's those crunched out six pack abs. Even when I have no fat, it still looks like there's abs there, but they're more elongated, right?
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, that's what I'm going for now, and achieving it is elongating the front,
Yeah.
not
Well, it
just pumping up the back to battle the crushed front. You
that
know,
that does make sense. Like, obviously with enough hypertrophy in the rectus abdominis, like, you can still have an elongated rectus abdominis. And like, I don't really know how it would go, but like, if you were really obsessed with having a six pack and you wanted to maintain abdominal length, I don't really know how I do that necessarily. Maybe it would be some of the long range work, and I would do some antagonistic work as well, but I'm not 100% sure. Again, it's because we have the goals of optimizing locomotion at the expense of some of these other, vanity metric goals. It's hard to prioritize that. I even think about, like, okay, what's one of the most popular abdominal movements called? It's literally a crunch. You're crunching the front part of you're literally crunching your abdomen in, and that's what you're training your body to do, is to crunch your your rectus abdominis down so that you create this, like, sort of image of separated abdomen.
can you think of a scenario where you're doing that in real life outside of a
Like
specialty sport?
trying to get up off the floor, maybe like
Mhm.
the initial, like, if you're laying on your back and you have that initial crunch up to like hoist yourself up
Yep.
with your arm. That's the one situation that I can think of, like, functionally, that you would be doing a crunch.
Is the best way to train getting up to pump up the abdominal muscles is to the maximal level and hope that that's what propels you up? Or is there a way to get up off the ground that's very smooth that you can do with the joints of your body using, like a Turkish get up, let's say, even though that's probably
Yeah.
not the optimal way to do it? Um, Something like that would be more superior to me versus just using the abs to crunch up to get up. Even though, like,
Mm,
I'll just throw out the Turkish get up because I don't really love it, but it was just an analogy to say that there's a better way to do things, right? Um,
mhm.
Now again, if I want like bigger abs and more abs, then I'm gonna do crunches. Like, that's just the
Yeah.
way it is, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that nobody can do it. It's just that um, for optimizing locomotion and getting out of your front chain, it's wise to elongate the front and not have it completely crushed all the time.
Mhm. If you think about, I always think about sprinter bodies, right? And like, sprinters have some of the sickest abs of any sport, in my opinion. Um, and I think that's a result of, a lot of that spinal waving that happens, that side to side contraction. They have incredibly well developed obliques. Even if they're back chain dominant and they're really extended, they still have that spinal side to side action, and that sort of, like, unilateral passing of back and forth of that energy really promotes abdominal development. And you still have to stay, you still have to, like you said, you have to have enough stability to maintain that head over foot behavior. And if you're stable enough to do that at high speed, your abdomen is really well developed, I reckon. So training locomotion directly won't necessarily get you a conventional bodybuilder style six pack that looks like, a set of bricks just on the front of your body, but it will develop your abdomen in a very functional, healthy way.
Yeah, absolutely. With regards to sprinters, I think there is like even within this industry and this niche of biomechanics and all that, a little bit too much of an obsession with looking at sprinters and extrapolating that they're doing everything correctly. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that go to guys do that. I don't see them doing that exactly. And in fact, what I see is most sprinting assessments being side view and not being able to see what's actually going on with the motions. Okay, but that aside, it's good to look at sprinters, the best sprinters in the world, and see what they're doing to create torque to you know um, how they're doing the things that they're doing and the commonalities and all that. But I don't think that being looking at Olympic sprinters is the way to extrapolate completely how to do things for the average person, right?
No.
Because you can still have a giant engine and have parts that are failing. Okay. So it's more like with a straight line sprinter, you could be more like a stock car. You could put a 900 horsepower engine on a Honda Civic and still go straight and it'll work. But as soon as you take a turn, you're screwed. Right. So it's
Mm.
like, I would definitely look at more at athletes that cut and have to move that way and the best ones that do those movements versus straight line sprinters.
Yeah, and even sprinters, you can break down their even elite level sprinters, you can look at their form and be like, this probably isn't optimal for everyday human movement. You might look at a sprinter that stayed injury free for most of, if not all of their career, and kind of look at their biomechanics and sort of compare them against other people who've stayed injury free, or elders, or indigenous cultures, and see what movement commonalities there are. That's the thing about observation, is that you need a significant amount of observation to see consistencies among many different data sets. It's not just you're not just like looking at one thing like we used to do with bodybuilding magazines. You look at big guys, it's like, oh, guy with big muscles, he does it this way. That's how I should do it. That's one data set, right? But if you look at like when you're trying to figure out biomechanics, especially, you want a big data set of multiple observations and finding the consistencies amongst those observations.
Oh, absolutely. That's really the way to do it, right? Like consistencies amongst observations in the biomechanics field is the way to go, and it's very unique because it is visually based, right? Like compared to other sciences, you can see it happen right in front of you. So, um, putting that within the scientific field or within the scientific community would be a good idea, as opposed to relying on the research for everything, right? And
Well, the word "the" research, right? It's usually based on, it's like, I feel like it would be harder to set it in the constraints of a scientific study. You could put together a large data set, and you could have a meta analysis of 50,000 different injury videos done in slow motion, and it's like, hey, we found that of these 50,000 videos of this exact same injury, we found that 90 something percent of them demonstrated this one behavior, and that would be statistically significant. And then you could take another 5,000 or whatever, how many thousand videos of people who never injured themselves, and you could say, hey, like, of all of these videos of these people who never injured themselves, we found whatever percentage of this data consistent. Like, when Goda is criticized for not using scientific principles to validate their theories and their methods, it's just because we haven't, like, the data is there. I think the visual data is there, the statistical data is there. It just hasn't been codified in the structure or the publication of a study.
Absolutely. This reminds me of a little internet debate I had the other day. I can't remember who it was, but it was on a go to video, right? And
Mm.
the go to video showed slow motion of I can't remember who it was. I think it was Odell Beckham Jr. actually, tearing his, I can't remember if it was the ACL or Achilles, but basically, during his injury, you can see him landing on the inside edge of his foot, and he tore his ACL, right? Let's just say it's the ACL. Can't
Mm,
remember which one it was.
mhm,
But the person that commented on it, I think it was a physiotherapist, and they said, well, there's no proof that this happens. And here's the proof that it's not valid. So I looked at the article. They sent a PubMed article. I'm like, show me where there is a proof against what Goda's saying. Okay. Because
mm,
Goda's showing me the visuals. Okay. And I'm seeing them over and over again. And I'm seeing the injury mechanism happen. And in that inside ankle bone low position, pushing off the inside edge of the foot. So
mm,
where's the proof that this doesn't happen? Because I've seen it 300-400 times now, right? Like, because I watch a lot of slow mo and I haven't seen
mm,
the opposite. So he sends me an article on PubMed. I look at the PubMed article and it's a meta-analysis, like you said, right? And the meta-analysis was like, there's no proof that valgus and causes ACL tears. And I look at it, and their variables of how they're defining this are all over the place, and none of them apply what Goda is saying. Okay, so they're using variables that are from the linear cadaver model, saying that there's no correlation. And trust me, it takes a trained eye to be able to see the correlation. I don't see very many people with this good trained eye. It's all side view assessment. That's the truth in the scientific world. So your whole argument, or like the argument, is that this data disproves the visuals that you can see, and therefore we can discard the visuals and the correlations that happen there, and the 300 of the same mechanism in the injury that you saw, because this paper that has linear cadaver models all over it says that the mechanism that you say happens does not happen. It's
mm.
so ridiculous. It's like, let's just get the visuals and put them in an arena of ideas, and let's have debates, right? Like,
It
I don't know why
it
we have
really
to not look at them.
it reminds me when I was vegan, to be honest, because like my health was deteriorating really quick about 2 years into eating a completely plant-based diet, and I was doing it right. Like I had spent over 10,000 hours studying nutrition and listening to different lectures on nutrition and looking at peer-reviewed medical research. And I remember like there's a guy named Dr. Michael Grieger has a book called How Not to Die, and it has over 5,000 scientific studies that validate that a whole foods plant-based diet is the most disease resistant, healthiest, best diet for the human being. Meanwhile, my guts were getting destroyed, my mental health was declining, I had no libido, like, and I was eating like 4,000 calories a day trying to get my daily micronutrient recommendations for while I was training for CrossFit. So I was, like I was a mess all the time. And but like in my head, it was like, but there's so much science to prove that what I'm doing is the right way. And like it was basically I was prioritizing scientific proof and the perspectives from like literally thousands of scientific studies over my own direct experience. I was trusting science over my own experience. And so when you're looking at these data sets and these meta analyses that are directly contradicting what you're seeing in front of you, like it's like, no, what you're seeing isn't actually what you're seeing because the science says it isn't, then you kind of have a problem because it's directly interfering. Well, and I'm not saying that perception is the end all be all, right? Because you can perceive the wrong thing. Like your subjective viewpoint can be wrong as well. And I kind of gaslighted myself for a long time while I was vegan because I'm like, oh no, it's not that the diet is bad. It's just that I'm doing it wrong. So I'd make a tweak, I'd take more B12, I'd do more supplements, I'd take more probiotics to digest all the fiber that was destroying my stomach. Like I did so much to try and like convince myself that it was like that my direct experience was wrong somehow and the science was right. But in the end I had to go with my literal gut. And I started eating a more animal based diet, and my health and my digestion and my energy and my mental health and my libido, everything just skyrocketed after I did that. And it took me a good couple of years of recovering from a vegan diet to finally realize like shit, I was like in maximum cognitive dissonance mode because I was only looking at what the science said and not trusting what was happening in front of me.
It's interesting. So going through school, it's very research based, meaning that like you're a good like in my field, chiropractic, you're a good chiropractor. I know this is in physio and sports med and all that. Um, you're a good practitioner when you're research based, because when you're research based, you're going with the best research. Literally, that's what it means, right? And the best research to you is the top scientists in the world who are thinking about this constantly, have given you the best information, and that's a trust that you have, right? However, now when I look at the a study, I don't just go, oh, this is, this prestigious journal, so it's right, or this is the latest research. I now go straight to the methods,
Mm.
and I want to see how they're doing it. I want to see what is your actual, how did you plan out this study?
Yeah.
And most don't meet my expectations on how they're actually performing the study. That meta-analysis was a perfect example for me, because as soon as I read it, I went straight there, and the way that they're classifying knee valgus, they don't even understand GOTA. They won't understand the rotary model. So you just proved that things don't happen a certain way using your own model, right? So there's a lot of that. It comes down to this. There's a new paradigm, and that's looking at the movement,
Mm.
actually visually seeing it, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of the educated people don't want to look at it because it goes against years of education. You're supposed to be the smart guy. You're supposed to be the one with the information. How can these guys in, let's say, GOTA, like Coach Gill, how can this guy who's not educated at all in the field, like formally, how could he find the way to move correctly in nature, like actual fractals of movement?
Yeah.
How is he the one that found it versus all these Harvard professors or, PhDs? And there's thousands and thousands of them working and compiling information. However, did you have your first principles correct? Are you working off the correct information?
Mm.
Somewhere down the line, you didn't check your work. And that meaning the people that came before you. Okay. So a lot of, in the scientific world, it's working on top of data. You're working on principles, and then you just build up on that. But if your first principle has a flaw in the foundation, then the flaws are going to be all above those levels as well, right? So
Mm.
that goes back to me looking at the methods of how research is done when I get sent a paper. How did these people come to their conclusion, not the conclusion itself? Now, with the public, I think what the public does is most people just, it's in the news, it's in the social media. It's like, oh, Harvard says that this happened, so this is how it is, right? They don't even
Yeah.
go to the level of reading the research themselves.
And a lot of
It's
people
like,
don't know how to read the research themselves. Like I remember when I was doing nutrition, I would message my brother, or I would message a friend. He's a physicist. To be like, "Hey, I think that this is what the study is saying, and I'm looking at the methods. How far off am I?" And sometimes it'd be like, "No, you got it." And then other times they're like, "Dude, you're misinterpreting this completely. Like you have no idea how they actually did this. This study is actually very poorly designed." And I'm like, "Oh shit." Most people don't know how to read scientific studies, and so we're in this position where scientific journalism, which any actual scientist sort of despises because it dumbs down the nuances of some of the conclusions and the studies that are being presented in scientific journalism. You have to rely on this dumbed down version of it that can be biased to give you a message that is just as biased for whatever message the media wants you to hear.
yeah, like in terms of what we're doing, I just want to know that they've looked at other ways to do it, or like they've looked at all the variables that need to go into the study design. Now, I know more than most people because obviously we do this all the time, right? So I'm like, oh, they missed this, and this variable. It's like, wait, who are these guys that are actually doing this study, right? And then you'll find like a lot of them don't have their own movement practices. A lot of them don't ever move themselves. They'll go to a gym and they'll lift weights.
Yeah.
And then that's the paradigm, right? Because that's the pinnacle. Right now, the pinnacle is lifting weight. Everything has to be looked at through that lens. It's like, okay, we have these exercises. They're for biomechanics. They're going to help you spin your femur in a better behavior this way. But it's like, okay, so can I add weight to it? Or how do I do this with weights? It's like, why does the weight have to be there? It's just like an external resistance needs to be there. And it doesn't always have to be an external load of weight. It can be many, many different things. However, that goes back to more of the, how culturally it's all about weights. It's all about force and resistance in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's like, that's the standard. Like me too, when I was originally studying strength and conditioning, it was like the scientific studies that I would look at were, ways to optimize force production or ways to optimize muscle hypertrophy or motor unit activation. That was sort of the lens that I was looking through because I was a lifter. And in my mind, it was like, oh, like I fixed a lot of my posture with lifting. I lost a bunch of, like, I lost 100 pounds lifting weights. I never, like, lifting weights and walking on an incline treadmill. I lost 100 pounds doing that. Right when I was young, I weighed a lot. And lifting was one of these. So in my mind, it was like lifting is the end all be all. This is how you become a better human. Like, you literally, you just have to lift these weights. And it's funny because I just had I just had a conversation with a good buddy of mine who was he lived in Banff, and he's a really hardcore guy. And she was like, what's this go to thing, man? Like, I'm almost afraid to learn about it. I'm almost afraid to know, because it seems like it would be a red pill. He's like, you know, like, the barbell obviously isn't natural, but could, training with a sandbag or like a hex bar, like, surely that's a little bit better than just moving. And I'm like, dude, like, it's literally, it's just that it's not the implement, it's the linearity of the movement that's really fucking you over. And so, you can study the nuances of motor output and of hypertrophy and maximizing these things, and there's really good research on how to optimize that and how to prevent injury for that and how to do, how to reverse the damage that you're doing with that. But it's still the mindset of linear movement. And it's the lifting lens is fundamentally linear movement. Even the little bit of transverse movement that you have with, like, the cable that you'll move in a transverse plane, that still doesn't kind of honor the sort of spiral dynamics that start from the ground and wave all the way up through your spine. And that was something I learned too, because when I started doing Goda, the feedback that I got on my runs was, you're emphasizing this transverse spinning of your shoulders way too much. You're not actually bending your spine. You're literally just rotating from your thoracic while your legs are, driving you forward. And I'm like, but I thought that was the spinal engine. I'm waving from side to side. It's like, yeah, but you weren't actually spiraling that motion, because I've been trained to go frontal, sagittal, and transverse plane and not actually combine them into that spiral dynamic movement from my foot all the way through my spine out my head.
Yeah, it's just the bottom line is locomotion movement is different than lifting. Okay, they're two different things. You can apply some lifting and some external resistance to locomotion, but at the end of the day, locomotion usually happens with you and your body and the parts that go with it, right? So for me, learning how the parts move and making it automatic that they're moving the most optimal way possible is the goal.
Mhm.
Okay, so the amount of external loads that I use is very, very minimal at this point. However, I'm a thin guy, right? Like, so it's, if I wanted to get more hypertrophy, I would probably go to weights because that's the best way to do it, right? Like, in
Mhm.
terms of actual, if your goal is to get hypertrophy, it's known how to do it, right?
Yeah.
The two things are different though. They're just different implements and different goals, and it's hard for the average person to fathom putting away the weights, especially athletes, right? We're talking more of the athletic population here. It's hard to let go of the barbell in
Mhm.
terms of, no, it's just you and your body, but how much can I lift, right? Like, I
Yeah.
don't get it.
Well, it's funny because even I started, in my own practice, I started playing with a little bit more landmine stuff, and I tried to do some loaded drop-ins with a landmine. So I loaded this thing up and I put it in a front rack position, and I spiraled into that drop in and got into that back chain dominant position, and I was doing some reps. And I posted a video up, and one of the coaches messaged me. He's like, "Dude, that's cool and everything, but when you come to the top, look what your hips are doing." And I was looking at my hips, and I would do this drop in. I'd be super back chain dominant, and then I'd come back to the center and I'd push my hips forward like I'm doing a deadlift. I'm like, fuck,
Was
I'm
that the
still
other
doing
day,
it.
like a week ago?
That was like, yeah, just a week
Yeah.
ago. And I was like, God damn it. Like, I'm still doing these these horrible patterns that as soon as I start to, add this resistance, like, I try to jump ahead all the time, because for me, I've been like, when I was lifting, I progressed really quickly in lifting. It was really gratifying. It was something that was like tangible. So I'm like, okay, can I add some element of resistance training? My shoulders feeling a little bit better. I can start training, after surgery now. So I wanted to start adding some resistance. And I'm like, that lifter mindset screwed me over because I'm movement quality and I'm training bad patterns again. I'm like, damn it.
I know what you mean on that. Yeah. So for me, I put away the weights probably like 3 years ago. I still swing mace bells, still swing weighted ropes. Like I have a pretty heavy rope, and when I swing it in the infinity pattern, in the getting in the 22.5, I don't want to get too deep into it, but basically I
Mm,
swing heavy ropes in circular patterns, right? And I try to keep the principles together, and that's how I'm doing resistance training now, and I find it more fruitful for movement versus just linear direct training. Think about this: like, is there a scenario? Maybe I'm incorrect. Maybe you can uh, think of a scenario where I'm wrong here. But the heavier you go, the more linear you have to go. So your movement has to become more linear as you increase weight. Think about like if you have your max weight on a barbell, you want that path, the bar path, to be as linear as possible, right?
mhm.
Same with deadlifting. Same with
Yep.
anything. The heavier the implement, the more straight you have to be. Eventually, your body becomes like that, where it's like straight movement. Yeah, you're going to be strong in one plane of movement, and when you're applying force into the ground a lot. That's another thing that we were talking about the other day. That's interesting is force application into the ground. When I'm boxing, I'm trying to be quick force application, meaning that like I want my foot to touch down for like 0.0001 second. And I want to be able during that time to apply force in either a movement or out of my limbs. Okay. If I choose to do so. I
Mm,
don't want to stay in the same spot for a long time if I don't have to. If I choose to, that's fine. However, I don't want to be rooted if I don't have to. If the said principle is true, if you specifically adapt to your demands, isn't putting force through the ground for a long period of time, like what you're doing when you have weights, you have to put force through the ground a lot, like the antithesis to moving fast, to actually having fast turnover at your feet. It definitely does to me in my own practice. I feel that it does in boxing and in striking motions.
mm.
And I suspect it does with running as well. Now, that will be a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people because they're like, no, 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 that just makes you stronger. Right. And there's no force application time, that variable that makes much of a difference here. You're just pushing through your feet harder. So it's better. Right.
Mm.
Yeah, I'm willing to debate that one. I'm not sold completely, but I feel it in my own body during striking.
Yeah, because I think what's fascinating too is because you're talking about pushing force through your feet, which in a heel toe model, in a linear movement or a linear locomotion model, where you're driving, you're pushing into your foot and you're driving through the big toe, more force production does kind of make more sense because you're putting a super flat part of your foot. But when we're talking about a rotary model, we're talking about spinning the energy off of your foot. You're not like when I've started running a lot more. My own practice was like, I want to learn how to run because as someone who has always lifted and has always prioritized shorter bursts of energy and energy systems, never really trained my aerobic base, and just in general have never been able to run comfortably because like I was always clunky. I deadlifted and all I did was like every time I stepped into the foot, it was like an earthquake through my body. So I'm like, I want to learn how to run efficiently and enjoy running. So the practice that I have right now is I'll run at the fastest speed that I can while keeping my step as light as possible, prioritizing that pivot of the energy, and I can run pretty fucking quick without putting a lot of force through my foot. I'm still landing and but like I'm absorbing force into my system and then pivoting it off, right? So is it that you need to be able to produce more force, or would you want to train yourself to be able to have biomechanics and tissues that can absorb more force through that bowing motion? Like Goda talks about bows and corners. You still need strong tissues to absorb force into a bow. If you're running faster and you're absorbing more energy, that's not your native for, like, you're not producing that force production. You're absorbing that force and then pivoting it out and transferring it efficiently. So do you need musculature to have greater force production, or do you need more resilient tissues and thicker tissues that can absorb force into that bow and transfer it fast?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question, right? Again, like going back to the fascia and the connective tissue model, I want my connective tissue to behave elastic, right? To behave
Mm.
like an elastic. If I have my joints in the right position as I land and I can pulse my muscles at the right time, that's optimal to me. Now, I can hypertrophy my muscles to make them bigger. That will actually thicken the fascia, or not thicken, but tighten the fascia on the outside of the muscle. Okay. And then maybe I can use that as a way to propel harder. No,
Mm.
sprinters are thick for a reason. There's not a lot of thin sprinters. Some come to mind, like Andre DeGrasse. Who else? There's a few that are thinner, right? But most are thick and big musculature. Now, I don't know if they're weight training. It's possible that a lot of them are weight training now, but even when you look back in the 50s and 60s, a lot of them are pretty big and jacked, right? So there is something to straight line sprinting short bursts. Having musculature for that is a good idea if that's your goal, if that's your only goal, right?
Mm.
But my goal is efficiency. I'd rather give up like, and this might sound weird to an athlete. I might give up 0.2, 0.3 seconds on my 40 time to be more efficient in my movement because I want to do other things as well. I don't just want to prioritize that, right?
Yeah.
So going back to the question, if given, you know, I don't have to work too hard for it, I'd rather have bigger muscles, okay? Stronger elastic connective tissue, okay? They don't have to be huge muscles, but big enough to pulse fast, okay? Connective tissue that absorbs and coils and elastic really well, and joints that are painless and can land in perfect positions to go to my next maneuver.
Well, and that's way more eloquently articulated than what I was trying to say. That sums up what I was trying to say. It's like I like you don't need a ton of motor unit recruitment, and you don't need a ton of muscular hypertrophy in order to like. I still think the tendonal thickness and the resilience of your tissues is important, but it's the set principle in my mind is getting more and more specific in terms of that training specificity thing. If you're like I'm starting to think that a lot of the force output stuff and the like it is specific adaptations to impose demands. What demands are you imposing on your tissue adaptation when you're lifting weights versus when you're recoiling the force of your foot landing and pivoting this energy? Like what's the difference in the tissue stimulus? If force is the language of the cells, as Dr. Andrew Ospina has said, and we've quoted a couple of times in previous episodes, if force is the language of the cells, what's the difference in the force of lifting, like you said, driving your feet through the ground and having this maximum motor output versus elastic recoil? Those are two different types of force.
Absolutely. And that's, I mean, we can get in the weeds there, right? Because force being the language of the cells, yeah, that's true. They respond to force, but is the small, like, does the sum of the parts equal the whole there? Right?
Mm.
Because at a cellular level, yeah, they do respond like that. On a systemic level, um, I'm asking this more as a question. Does the sum of the force at the cells equal the system? Because let's put it this way: if I put force on the cell, that could equal more force could equal, like a heavy squat.
Hmm.
Okay, so at the cellular level, yeah, it's there's more force being applied to the cell, and let's say it's a squat in ATG range. Let's say it's an ATG split squat. Okay, just so
Hmm.
we're pretending it's the largest range possible. Okay, your cells are going to adapt to that at a cellular level. I look at a microscope. I'm like, okay, these cells have adapted to be resilient, strong, but where's the rotary component there? Where's the spiral energy component to the adaptation? That one can't really be seen on a microscope. You have to go to the larger picture to really get the view there, right? So to me now, force doesn't always equal the language of the cell, right? Or I shouldn't even say that. Force isn't only applied to the cell. The said principle, it should be applied at the higher level, at the spiral level.
Well,
I
that
don't know
that
how to exactly articulate that. That's kind of where I'm going with it, though.
but
It's a
that
new idea.
I think that that's kind of where where I was coming from, right? Because if you're doing a, let's say, a barbell back squat and or an ATG split squat, or you're practicing high level sprints, or you're doing go to drop ins and you're practicing that spiral mechanic, those are all levels of force. And let's say that the weights are somehow equivalent, or the force production is somehow equivalent, that when you're doing a barbell back squat, like if you had a force plate or something and you could measure the exact amount of force that's being output, you're you're applying force in the exact same amount in these different ways. Like if you're practicing rebounding out of a drop in position, and you're practicing a rebounding spiral versus you're dropping into a back squat at high speed, that you could be producing the same amount of force. Like I used to drop into squats, like I would have 400 pounds on my back and bounce out of the hole. And for me, I was practicing that elastic recoil and that turnaround, and that made me really springy in the frontal and sagittal planes, right? Like I could jump straight up super high because of that. But like my run was not efficient. My walk was not efficient. Nothing was actually efficient. And I had elasticity in my hips, but only in the context of a squat. Like I could bounce in and out of a squat like no problem. I couldn't bounce in and out from side to side when I was running. So, you know, force is like, again, it's like when you're thinking about the said principle, you need to get really specific. I've seen some really funny memes of people who kind of trash talk the functional fitness community. Like there was I think I sent you one meme. There was this guy who was playing basketball and he kind of was dribbling, and then he took a 3-pointer, and then it shows a scene of him in the gym, and he's on the cable machine and he's doing the same back and forth, and he does a free throw with the cable machine. It's like sports specific training with he's doing this like cable free throw. I laughed because I'm like, okay, it's funny, but like I wouldn't do weighted free throws because that's not specific to shooting free throws. But when you're thinking about cutting, and you're thinking about running, and you're thinking about being able to move well in these positions, it's like, just do that more, train it more.
Absolutely. With what you said with the squat, I had the exact same experience. I could bounce out of the squat with heavy weight and no problem. I was very elastic, and because you're like that, I want to drop in the squat all day. And my
Yeah.
vertical jump was a lot better. But squatting does transfer to vertical jump much better, because in the vertical jump, your hips are accelerating forward, your spine is accelerating backwards for the most part. It definitely does uh, accelerate and heighten your jump, right? With the squat though, that elastic energy at the bottom does not transfer to the elastic energy in your run. So yeah,
Mm.
at a cellular level, I can put it on a microscope. Oh, the adductors have this elastic property now, and the force from the squats has adapted your cells, so we're good. Except that in reality, the said principle works with very specific movement as well, right? So it's an interesting topic to explore there.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, like that, for me, that was like the big aha moment of realizing that just because I'm developing this elasticity in one range doesn't mean that I have universally elastic tissues. And that was even when I was doing the ATG program, I felt springier, right? I was like, oh, like I have this range. I'm feeling a little springier in my step, and I have these, maybe like I did some tendonal conditioning, and so I have like a little bit more tendonal resilience in these ranges. But try to get me to run or do lateral shuffles, or do anything, like I couldn't do it because I was still forward, like just um linear movement the entire time.
Yeah, I'm not sure where the thought that the said principle would apply from, squatting and deadlifting and the traditional linear weights into three-dimensional movement. Like I don't know how you get the said principle and then come to the conclusion that those two, like a squat will make you a better runner. How? How is that doing that? I've never got that answer, and I never really answered it in my own head. We're talking years ago, right? because that was
Mm,
the wisdom of the day. It was, squats, deadlifts, heavy lifts will make you better at running. You just have to do them intelligently a little bit, right? To me now, what makes you better at locomotion is looking at your locomotion and seeing what you're missing and adding it in, or vice versa, really. If you're doing something a little extra, you got to take it out, that's fine too, right? So we can
mm.
be much more specific with each body part, and we can have models of movers that we want to move like. For me, it's Michael Jordan. I think cuts beautifully, right? The movement, the energy is very, very. It looks simple. It looks simple when he's doing things. That's what I love. Um, there's many others that I can name, but I think Michael Jordan is my go-to elder to look at, even though
He's
I'm looking at him when he's
your
young, right?
ultimate. That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
super
for sure.
cool. I don't really have, it's funny because like for me, I haven't found my sort of end all be all movement role model, so to speak. I used to really admire the movement of uh, Roy Gold and Ido Portal. So like all the guys
Mhm.
from like the Ido Portal method in Israel. I always found that movement was so fluid. And as an artist, like I'm a painter and I'm a musician, and like I've always been involved in visual arts, and I've always found dance like this incredible art. So seeing this fluid movement and this like seemingly universally resilient ability throughout the body in these multiple ranges, it was like, wow, this is incredible. So I was obsessed with parkour athletes as well. Like I think I mentioned on one of our more recent episodes, I used to do parkour when I was a little kid, and I'd jump off these like 20-foot roofs landing in a roll, and that was the first exposure to transferring energy instead of absorbing energy. Was like, you can it like you can't fall straight down off of a 20-foot building, but if you run and you jump off a roof and you're able to have this diagonal uh trajectory down towards the ground, you can transfer the energy into a roll and dissipate the force and not hurt yourself. And so I learned how, like my friend and I would do this. We started on like 2-foot drops, and then we got up to 5-foot drops, and then 10-foot drops. Eventually we were like, we probably spent like half an hour on top of this roof, like, fuck, we're gonna fucking die, but let's do it anyway. And so we like find, like half an hour of like psyching ourselves out. We finally run, and we jumped off this roof and landed in a roll. We're like, oh my god, we did it, and we never did it again. But um, I didn't have anyone who was a locomotive role model, or a role model where someone could transfer energy from one direction to the other to the next. I had parkour athletes and people who use movement as art. And movement as art, like dancers have horrible joints in a lot of instances, like ballet dancers or contemporary dancers. They always end up with some sort of joint issue. Maybe they're not training their tissues as effectively as they could be, or maybe they're just doing too much movement, and creating dysfunctional laxity in different parts of their system. Kind of depends on what kind of dance you're involved in. But Ido Portal was always a huge inspiration of mine when I was trying to go from rigid power lifter lifting type to more fluid mover.
Ido Portal and Roy Gold, who you're mentioning, they were
Mm,
also who kind of inspired me first to take a look outside of the lifting paradigm. Like, what are these guys doing? And even right now, Roy Gold's control of his body is next level. It's probably one of the best in the world that I've seen anyway.
yeah.
And just his static control and how he can move his joints. Um, I would love that, right? I'd love to be able to learn that because there's no downside. That feels great on your joints, having that much control. However, is it my priority? Would it be my priority to learn from scratch? Absolutely not. It's more locomotion based. That is gravy. And to me, what do you like? I don't know if any of the audience know who he is. They probably do, actually. But basically, he can control his body in ways. He does spinal waves. He does um, very large range of motion movements that are very, very difficult. So,
Mhm.
with it being enviable, at the same time, I don't train exactly to have that as my priority.
And these guys are, their whole life is movement. They'll train for like a minimum of 3 hours, and that's a light training day, right? The movement culture paradigm is that like you're always moving, you're always adapting to something, you're always exceeding your boundaries. And like the first live stream that I ever did on nofilter.net was actually with the mindful mover, a guy named Phil Chubb, who right now the training paradigm that he teaches is once a week training for an hour. It's like just literally once a week strength training, and then you recover. But he used to be he got kicked out of Ido Portal's movement culture because he was questioning this paradigm of like always training and always moving and always adapting to these new stimulus, because he kept injuring himself. He spent like, I think he's told me he spent like a few years trying to get a one arm handstand, and he finally got it. And he's like, now what? He's like, I injured myself. I ate tons of food so that I could get all this muscle. I was like, dedicated my whole life and trained hours a day to get this one arm handstand. Now what? Am I a good mover yet?
Well, maybe it was if you're training towards one arm handstand, that's not exactly, what the body does for the most part. So you are going to get some injury. That's a very extreme thing to train, right? Like the amount of people that can do that naturally, probably zero, right? You have to really go hard at it. And you're pouring a lot of energy into that. That's one of the most underrated aspects of training is like, what are you actually pouring your energy into? You only have a finite amount of time and energy. Yeah, you can do a one arm handstand, but is it smart to, he probably pumped hundreds of thousands of calories into, pumping himself up to be able to hold
Millions.
millions of calories, whatever it is, right? And he was able to achieve it. And now he's like, now what? Right?
Yeah.
Am I better at locomotion? Am I better at anything in real life? I can hit up this one arm handstand, but that's the limit, right? So I would love to see some of these Ido Portal guys. I would love to see them run and cut. I want to see what
Yeah.
it looks like. They don't do a lot of that. I noticed they do a lot of not stationary movements. They're moving, but they're not actually locomoting in the normal human sense, right?
Yeah, they're not. There's not a lot of walking and running in the traditional, like how you would just go for a longer walk or longer run. The locomotion. Ido Portal was the first person that I heard use the term locomotion drills when I first got into it. Like he was the first person that got me into the idea of locomotion. I still remember the YouTube video. He was doing these horse walks and the lizard crawls, and like he was the first person to have be like, hey, watch the locomotion patterns of animals and be inspired and start emulating them. What he didn't do apparently is, hey, watch the locomotive pattern of human beings and emulate it. Like optimize the human locomotive pattern.
That's hilarious. He's probably done more lizard crawls than he has walked. Like miles wise, right? Because I haven't seen him do a lot of walking or running. It's just very interesting, right? I don't want to hate on Ido Portal because he was a huge inspiration for me, but
Yeah.
yeah, like I think it moved past it in that I do see locomotion as the priority, and that being on 2 feet, not on 2 hands, not on 4 feet, even though you can use that as like I use crawling as a way to rehab and do things slowly and get mindful and work that spinal engine. Very easy way to work the spinal engine. Very gentle way to feel using the outside edge of your hands and your feet. Getting used to that. That's all gravy, right? But most of the training should be done, in my opinion, 2 feet and how you're going to be moving 99% of the time in real life.
Yeah, agreed. And I mean we're that's the angle that we're kind of coming at this podcast with is, what is the most natural? What's the optimized? I think in the intro I recorded that we're trying to find the grand unified theory of human movement. And the grand unified theory of human movement is really basically, it's not what can you force the human body to adapt to be able to do? Because that's a pretty, like, we're extremely adaptable. We can impose different types of stress to adapt in all kinds of crazy ways, and our body will adapt to it because that's just what it does. It's an adaptive mechanism. But the grand unified theory is, or how are we supposed to move, and then how can we optimize the actual design of how we're supposed to move, the actual evolutionary design basis of the human bodies and its movement.
Yeah, absolutely. In my mind, it is on 2 feet, and I think Coach Gill and Goat have found at least a partial theory, if not pretty complete. This is up for debate, right? Like, I never want to say something is complete because then you stop exploring, right? And that's been
exactly.
a problem throughout time. When I found WEC method, I thought that was it. I'm like, oh, side bend, spinal engine. They don't get it, right? Um, and the spinal engine was really the key uh, philosophy that unlocked a lot of movement for me. Who
Mm.
would have thought, right? Unlock your spine and then you can use it in your movement. It's a wild concept, eh? But it took a while to get out of that. You must keep stable, brace. So WEC was really the first one that got me out of that. And then it went, I explored functional patterns like movements, using the fascia to recoil you and to use that elasticity to recoil you into movements. I still
Mm.
use this all the time. It's not just functional patterns. You use it in like boxing is all about that, right? Um, and not just boxing, it's footwork. I apply footwork from boxing into almost everything. And vice versa. I look at footwork from dance and I'll apply it into boxing, but I'll keep the go to movements. I'll keep the go to principles, right? So um yeah, a lot of it is uh getting out of the straight plane, getting out of
Mm.
that stable, I'm going to hold rigid mindset and actual physicality into being able to move with a flexible spine and being able to harness that elasticity to get you in another position with balance. Okay. Those are the elements that you want. And to do that, I would use, back chain dominance being one of the biggest ones. If not, like the more time goes on, the more I see that as the biggest, right?
Mm. Mm.
Followed by being in your columns, making sure your head's over your foot and having a good landing bow. Okay. From there, the leaving position is obviously a lot harder, meaning that like when you push through the earth from your foot to spiral that energy correctly, most people are not. So it's really hard to rewire that part. So that takes a little bit more time to rewire the pushing of energy out of your foot. But the easy stuff is behavioral, butt behind rib cage, landing in a nice bow, landing on the outside of your foot, be back chain dominant.
Yeah, and like the more that we explore these concepts, the more that I apply them, I agree. The back chain dominant thing is the biggest lowest hanging fruit. Like I had a day the other day where I was pretty tired. I didn't get a great sleep, and I sat in my chair for a while, and I sat in a front chain dominant position for like, I don't know, 3 hours while I was working on my computer. And I was like, dude, that jacked me up so bad. Like that messed me up so bad for hours on end for the rest of the day. It was absolutely bonkers. I unfortunately have to wrap this episode up because I gotta get back to work. But for everyone who listened live, thanks for joining. For those who asked questions on the Instagram that we didn't get around to today, we will do that next episode. I will make sure that we have some Instagram posts pulled up and we'll be able to watch different clips of different movements so that you can actually watch. If you want to see that live, we do these live on nofilter.net where you can view all of our upcoming shows. Thanks, guys, for listening to episode 37, I believe, of the Art of Move podcast. It's been absolutely awesome having you guys joining this journey with us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, guys. Let movement be your medicine.